Welcome to Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today, we defend consumerism. Tim.
So before we start defending consumerism, and to a certain extent our defense of consumerism will be rooted in it, we should define it. So what is consumerism? So I think we'll have to state the obvious. We're temporal contingent beings to a large extent, whether or not there's something else out there, whether or not we can live without food. In general, we need food, and in most climates, you're going to need some form of shelter at least some time of the year. So we need a certain amount of goods to survive, let alone flourish. So that's first of all, that's stating the obvious. So then the question becomes, how much do we need? And noticing in these recent lockdown type scenarios and social distancing type scenarios, we've gotten this, I think this is a good analogy, this essential versus non-essential goods. And as a somewhat libertarian anarchist, I would say that all good, I would leave it up to people to decide what they think is essential. And I find this somewhat interesting. Like, are bike shops essential? Is yoga shops essential? Is home improvement essential? And even recently, this is I was watching a Reason magazine debate on this, and there was complaining that, hey, these surgeries are written off as non-essential. Getting your teeth cleaned or something like that. This is non-essential. Actually, at some level, I think that is essential. So what is consumers? I would define almost everything: vacations, healthcare. And this is going to probably tick off a lot of the critics of consumerism, because they'll say, oh, well, we don't mean that. We don't mean that. But part of my defense of consumers, I would include all of this. Now, I think a few statistics here is relevant. I imagine the numbers are roughly the same in the United States and elsewhere, but in Britain in the early 1940s, it was something like 3% of the GDP was spent on healthcare. Now it's like 7. In the United States, currently it's like 17%. I can't pull the number off the top of my head, but I think it was about 5 or 8 in 1960. So as you can see, we spend a lot more on healthcare. And up until recently, lifespans have gone up, infant child mortality rate, and I think that's all thanks to healthcare consumerism. I would agree with Hayek and, believe it or not, Michel Foucault, that these to a certain extent are just consumer goods. So even AIDS is something that we can sort of cure now, which we couldn't cure in years past. So as we can see, consumer goods and consumer consumption has expanded significantly since 1800. With the start of the Industrial Revolution, and then it doubles with the growth of railroad, and then again in recent times. So if you go to a doctor, you can get all different kinds of procedures. You can take longer vacations. You can fly across the oceans. That's something that cannot be done. Or houses bigger. This is one where the conservatives might be somewhat correct, but it depends on when. Most people before the year 1900 did not live in particularly large houses. They still had outhouses, no running water. So again, I would call this consumer goods. Now maybe the critics wouldn't call this consumer goods, but then this again fits into the definition of what exactly is consumerism. So far, Swithin, do you agree with my consumerism and some of my statistics and so forth? I would define it in almost everything in this. What do you say?
In one way, yes. I think you're exactly correct. Taking an economic perspective, there are consumer and producer goods, and the purpose of producer goods is to create consumer goods. And why do we want consumer goods? Well, because if we didn't have them, we would die. So that's kind of obviously true. Now, when it comes to just healthcare, before I get onto another aspect, I suppose the immediate objection is, well, we have an older population now, they live longer, therefore it is expected that the amount spent per head would be greater when you have an older population. Although, as you would point out, probably the advances in technology have facilitated this this average age, which has then led to even more health services to keep people alive even longer. So it's kind of interrelated. But on to consumerism as such. The problem, in my view, with consumerism is the people who deploy the word just use it pejoratively. I've never really come across a critic of consumerism who has had a cogent definition of what consumerism actually is. It basically just means spending money where the critic doesn't like. That's effectively what it amounts to. Now, that is not to say that you couldn't come up with a cogent definition as to what is in fact a good use of your money that you have spent and what is a bad use. I wouldn't say that. But the critic that I have encountered in this context has never provided such a definition. Now, with respect to essential and non-essential practices and shops, etc., the interesting aspect of defining something as essential and non-essential is, okay, well, it might be non-essential or essential from the point of view of the consumer, but it's certainly not non-essential from the point of view of the producer, because any job that puts food on the table, you could easily argue, is an essential job. So whilst from the consumer's perspective, you could say, oh no, they shouldn't need that. But the very fact that they do need it, they do want it and they buy it, actually facilitates somebody earning a living who otherwise may not be able to enjoy it. And so consumerism, as a definition, I would say yes, we're all consumers. Now, if you want to take what would be what would be the best sort of pejorative definition, it may be I suppose the fundamental critique of the opponents of consumerism comes to is that it takes a view that the individual should essentially be the caricature of the ultimate Randian, that everything is about them. They just use people and other things. So as opposed to treating people as an end in themselves, a la Kant, they use them purely as a means. And they treat things in this sort of purely instrumental manner, which allows them to maximize their utility. I suppose that might be the most cogent sort of criticism or pejorative definition of consumerism. But again, even if that's true, I don't think couching it in terms of consumerism is actually a helpful concept. Rather, you could go on, I don't know, well, you could just treat it from a virtue position, that, you know, they have the vice of greed or something like that. That might be a better way of going, although, again, greed is deployed in a somewhat haphazard manner. So those would be my sort of general intro thoughts.
One of the lines I like that you just said was, consumerism is something I disagree with. Something I disagree with you spending money on, or spending be pure Marx about spending your labor theory of value time on. Not that we're labor theory values, but nonetheless, I think that's the perfect definition where I think consumerism. You could even expand and say one man's consumerism is another person's essential industry. So now we're going to start moving into the objections to consumerism. And I think there are two general forms of objections to consumerism. I'm going to get to the first one, and that's environmentalism. My biggest problem with most environmentalists is they're basically empirically false, and they're conservatives without knowing it. That's my secondly objection. I mean, I'm going to get to the conservative one, but the first one, empirically false. We have more forests in places like New England. We have more forests in Europe now than we did before. Read Alex Epstein's Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, or read Matt Ridley's The Rational Optimists. We have more forests. The water is also probably cleaner now than it was in the Industrial Revolution itself, although this is a tricky question because you're dealing with the water quality might ebb or flow. So it's the idea that the idea that medieval societies were great for the environment is some idea I think that is basically false. And this is something that I think the Rational Optimist does a very good job at hacking away. We were in the process of cutting down the trees before the invention of use of coal, not invention of coal. And another point, we never run out of a non-renewable resource. We ran out of whale oil, but not coal, not oil. These are all super abundant. And I, in general, am, as the parts per million in carbon dioxide, to me, basically answers the question about climate change as well. If you look at the parts per million, it's not that big of an increase. I don't really understand why it would make that much big of a difference. So those to me are my general objections to the environmental things. They're basically empirically false. And this is going to relate to my second objection, which is why they're conservative. Natural is better. This is, I think, called the naturalistic fallacy. Natural is not always better. Maybe natural is better sometimes. But lots of cities are underwater based on some time period in the last few hundred years. So what exactly is the natural environment? I mean, as long as they don't fail, dams do stop water from going in and out. They stop great floods. They don't maybe stop the great flood. They stop minor floods. So just because something's natural doesn't necessarily mean it's good. And this is another thing that bothers me about the sort of environmental objections to consumerism. Oh, we're ruining the earth. Compared to what? In the myth of the ecological Indian, which is this is never a critique of they didn't intend to do this, but it's worth pointing out that the natives probably were in the process of hunting the buffalo to extinction. There's a great fee.org. There's a great article about this. I think it was written by Jeffrey Tucker or linked to by Jeffrey Tucker. And also, according to mainstream anthropologists, pre-Columbian societies, actually much further in the back, I forget the precise term, we're also in the process of hunting all the large mammals to extinction. So hunter-gatherer societies can equally destroy the environment and biodiversity as well. So just because actually this is where late modernity or late industrial society seems to do quite well protecting the environment. So hashtag more consumerism. So what do you make of the environmental objections and my characterization and why I think they're wrong?
The environmental objection has the problem primarily that it never asserts a standard of value by which it is going to measure whether the environment is getting better or it's getting worse. In general, it suffers massively from the status quo bias. What you'll see in the environmentalists, they'll say, oh no, the environment is changing. It's like, yeah, so? Oh no, but if it gets warmer or if it gets colder, they'll destroy this species. It's like, yeah, so? It's like, well, and other species will do better. Why do I care? The problem is you can't really assign a proper utility function for the environment outside of humans. Because what is good for the lion is not good for the antelope. I mean, that's now. There are certain circumstances in which you could say yes, they do want to kill some of the antelope because other things. So on a more general, that's possibly true in certain circumstances, but in most cases, what's good for one species is bad for another species. So I think the only real way of going about it is to say, well, look, we're humans. What's good for us is determined by our nature. So I would say here, you made reference to naturalistic fallacy, which I believe is coined by G.E. Moore, who effectively said you can't make a justification by existence argument. The fact that something exists, that is, it's natural in that sense, doesn't mean that it's good. I would distinguish this from a sort of an Aristotelian approach in which substances have in themselves have final causality, have inward directedness or built-in directedness, which determines what's good for them. And so I would take that respect to humans or rational animals. We don't need to go there in detail. But there are things that are good for us as humans. And it's clear that technological progress, and which has coincided with consumerism, is good for humans. And also, as you point out, in the external world, like hunter-gatherers and these primitive tribes, they aren't actually at one with nature. All they do is they leech off nature and just don't leech off it enough to get rid of everything. They don't actually add to the stock, the livestock, or the number of crops being produced. That's produced by arable and pastoral farming. This is a point Hans Hopper makes in his very good Short History of Man. The hunter-gatherers are far from like at one with nature. They're parasitic. And yeah, so when it comes to the environmental objectives, it's like, well, what's good and what's not? I mean, it's not obvious. And it seems clear that technological progress has made the environment much better for humans. One of the reasons why there's lots of respiratory disease in Africa is because they burn peat for heat. It's like, and then they have lots of lungs because peat is incredibly smoky. If you like whiskey, you can get peat smoked whiskey, and it's very smoky because peat is incredibly smoky. There was once a time I remember going to one of these like old Iron Age houses, and they were burning peat, and it's so smoky. There's no wonder it destroys your lungs if you're doing that on a regular basis. So, technological progress in coal, even for burning coal, is much more clean burning. And as you point out, as technological progress has gone on, we've got the internet, and you have metal usage. I mean, the number of wood that's been chopped down is significantly less. You get reforesting in Europe, which you might think is a good thing. I'm kind of agnostic, and to me, there seems to be quite a lot of trees. Do I want any more? Maybe. It's not immediately obvious whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think a lot of the people who advocate environmentalism are just implicitly hugely hubristic. They somehow know what is good for the entire environment, which is a massively complex system, which would seem not to have any immediately obvious solutions to it. And finally, if it was the case that the humans are causing catastrophic climate change, we can consumer society and technological advancements, which, unless people buy the technology, people won't produce it, at least not on a large scale. You can move people to different places, you can build dams, you can modify the effects of it. So I fail to see why that would be a bad thing. So I think the environmental critique is entirely false.
Okay, so the next big critique is the religious critique. Now, we're mainly from a Christian societies. Most of our, whether or not there are Christians is of some question, but so we're going to talk about the sort of Christian or religious objections. There are also, you could argue the Buddhists have a similar approach, but nonetheless, the Christian objections. You'll get this with someone like Roger Scruton, the tyranny, I think his article, is Tyranny of Pop Music. This is a standard line that many conservative Christians will say, that we spend too much time. It's idolatrous. It's unmeaningful work. The actual things are the actual thing we're consuming is probably sinful. So what do you make of the religious critiques of consumerism? If you could outline these.
So the religious critiques, or the moral conservative critiques, tend to fall into a multitude of different categories. One of them would be that, the consumer society creates massive wealth inequality, and the rich aren't providing income for the poor, which they should do. They should be providing arms for them to do so, and they don't in the consumer society, because what they value more than helping the poor is living a fun and entertaining life. So they might cite something like the parable of the rich man and Lazarus for that. The second critique would be that, from the Christian's perspective, more on the ascetic side, is that the physical world of goods and services, etc., distracts you from your major focus on God. And so what you should really do is live a very austere life in which there is much time for prayer and contemplation. That would be a second. And then the third critique would generally, well, okay, there's probably four, or maybe more. The third one would be that consumer society puts too much emphasis on goods and services that you can purchase, and it makes people value themselves not in who they are and their own virtues, but in what they can purchase. So that would be a third objection. A fourth objection related to that is what they might say is the market über alles aspect of the consumer society, in which services which ought not be fungible are treated as fungible. So, for example, you might say, oh, well, I could provide lots of childcare, and so the mother doesn't have to provide it, and so she can work outside the home and earn a decent amount of money in the workplace. The critique of this would say, well, no, the mother's mothering, as it were, or raising of the children is not fungible. It's not something that you can replicate by getting somebody else. You lose an essential aspect of what it is to be human and your relationship to your children. And the consumer society encourages these sorts of transactions, which are bad. And the fifth one would be related to the earlier one. People just consume things which are bad for them. So the standard critique of the working class is that they drink too much, they smoke too much, they spend their time watching trash on TV, and they are effectively vulgar, is probably the conservative critique. I think that covers all the bases. Tim, have you ever missed any there?
So I want to stress on this point you just made about the conservative critique here, because I think the Marxists also hold this critique that it's trash culture. And this is where I wanted to hit, to a certain extent, into somewhat of the causes of consumerism here. So the two Marxists who said that were Durkheim and who was it, Swithin?
Adorno.
And Adorno. So those two somewhat relate advertising as the growth of this. Now, this to me relates to false class consciousness, which I think to a certain extent is untrue. I agree with Brian Kaplan in this regard. When someone goes to McDonald's, they want to go to McDonald's. I agree with Tad Russell. When someone wants to watch a Five and Dime novel, they want to do that. When, name whatever trash piece of culture you want to watch, they want to watch that. I do not think it's a some sort of advertiser that's directly pushing there into it. Maybe on the margins. This plays a role. But I do think we have to hit this issue, because I think this is one issue the far left, so to speak, and the paleo right tend to agree on. Do you agree with my characterization? Do you think advertising makes people consumers? Like, they watch the thing on the TV, they go buy a bigger car. Do you think this? I've never really understood this critique. I mean, maybe I just have better impulse control, or maybe I'm just stuck in the matrix and I don't recognize it. What's your view on this, Swithin?
I think that advertising does work in a sense. Although I do think that advertising is unfairly singled out in many cases. I do think there is lots of influences on individual choices which are subconscious. Because a few people reflect on what they do and why they do it. So, yes, it is possible that people would see, oh, it's a really great new car, and then go, oh, no, I should, I feel really bad about myself. I should go and buy a car. And I suppose that's possible, but I think a lot of people go, that's a good car. Be good if I had it. Now, some people might go out of the way to sort of socially signal that they are a better person because they can afford a better car, which I suppose is possible. How many people do that? I'm not entirely sure. But I would say one of the bigger questions is, well, given all the money they spent, is that necessarily a problem? So, for example, they may be somebody who is just very into cars and don't spend on holidays or other things, but actually then decide to, spend money on a car, which is quite expensive. I suppose that's clearly possible. So a related story here. There was a woman who spent barely any money on food. She ate like the cheapest possible food she could and like the lowest possible rent, so that she could go on massively luxurious holidays like 3 times a year. And so if you just looked at what she spent it on, you'd be like, oh, look at this crass, vulgar female spending all this money on this luxurious holidays. But then you realize, well, actually, she doesn't actually spend much money on anything else. Because I think, interestingly, a lot of these critics of consumerism will probably pen their critique of consumerism from their MacBook Pro from Starbucks, in which they are using a laptop which is way more expensive than they need to do the same job in most cases, unless they do media editing, and spending money on coffee, which is like 20 times the amount, or if not more, than you could get at home if you were to do it yourself. So I think a lot of this is like, well, you need to look at the overall things that they're actually kind of spending on. So, yeah, does advertising make people feel bad about themselves? Maybe in some cases. But they're selling a product. You can't... I think a lot of this critique, again, is Marxist in orientation. It's like, oh, it's environmental determinism. It's like, oh, no, people can't be sort of... what's the word I'm thinking? Shielded from the effects or see through them. It's like, oh, no, they're just going to be pulled away and do it. So I don't think that's very good.
This relates to me to a question which I've always this relates to me to the core problems of Marxism itself, is the free will problem, and I think this fits right in with the conservative critique as well. Are people really that blind to it? And if people are so blind to this, it just renders analysis meaningless. Now, there is a problem where the standard economist line will just assume that everything that people do is rational. That is a problem. But I think if there are two errors, I think assuming that what quote unquote normal people do is irrational is more or less wrong. And secondly, your point about the MacBook Pro is very clear. It's very coherent. This is, to me, just the stinks of hypocrisy and poor performative contradiction. And this, of course, is very much true with the environmentalists as well. They all drive cars, they all fly around, blah, blah, blah. We all know that. The only group that I think that, and this is the only group I think that actually meets the standards of minimalism, is maybe the Amish. Not the Mennonites. The Mennonites live basically like everybody else, but the Amish. And the Amish do it for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Amish don't participate in Social Security. The Amish don't participate in most healthcare schemes in the United States, as well as the Amish generally stick to farming and carpentry. And they generally live right before the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, maybe the first few years. The Amish might be okay with railroads. But this is only the Amish. This is not the Mennonites. There's two main groups of these Anabaptists, from my understanding. So that you could free society. And this goes back to one of the questions that I think, and one of the reasons why I think the religious objections, including the conservative ones, are wrong, is the Luddite question. And the question I have is, were the Luddites right? So in 1790, for example, 90% of Americans were farmers, and even the 10%. This was the U.S. Census. Even the people that weren't doing farming were doing something directly related to farming, like blacksmith or carpentry, which is just to build stuff to do farming. Now it's something like 3%, and that 3% probably produces too much food and it produces steaks. You got to remember, Fish Friday was because that, or meat was on one day, was because that's the only day you ate meat. You ate a diet mostly of grain. Now, it could be the hunter-gatherers ate a slightly better diet, although there was much more varied. This is one of the things you start reading in the paleo diet literature. Hunter-gatherers ate probably, they didn't eat what paleo people claim they ate necessarily, because stuff would be not available all the time. So, but anyway, yes. So in many ways, the Amish are the only group to me that does. The Amish to me are stuck in the Luddite era, which is great and terrible. So the question is, what does everyone else do with their time? The 90, now that the 3% farm. Now one way we can solve it, we just force everyone not to use modern technology. The short-term future is we all starve to death under that situation if we start getting rid of industrial farming. So if you want to go back to that population number, this is where I think the Malthusian type economic people actually start making a point. But thanks to fossil fuels and stuff like that, we can now the planet can support 8 billion people. Isn't that great? I think that's great. The more the merrier here. So I want to ask you, Swithin, do you think the Luddites right? Because the answer to the Luddite question has been consumerism. Those lavish vacations. If you look at certain countries like Egypt or Italy, or Egypt and Italy, I think Egypt and Italy and France, like a quarter of their economy is tourism. That means 1 in 4 people you see is directly related to tourism. That's incredible. In places like the United States, Florida, which was recently shut down to the lockdown, similar numbers, if not higher. Disney World is the largest on-site employer in the United States, I think. So Swithin, do you think how would you respond to this? Were the Luddites correct question? Because if the Luddites,
okay, so were the Luddites right? No, they weren't. The problem with the Luddites is that given the society they have the opposite problem. Rather than having kind of like the problem of too much consumption, there is just too much work. And in a sense, because everyone's just doing farming and being hugely inefficient at doing so, which is interesting because it actually prevents any form of room to engage in what you could refer to as the higher pleasures. Some of Mill would make reference to, or the life of contemplation of Aristotle, or of prayer, with the ascetic would value, because you're spending all your time working, and if you're really tired from doing backbreaking work in the field, then you're not going to have any time to engage in these sort of higher pleasures of such. So I simply don't see the Luddites of having any value to them at all with their critique. I mean, asceticism and Ludditism in general is just it's a vice of deficiency. If you could say the consumerist who just sort of buys and lives for the now, then yeah, okay, you could say that that's not a virtuous or a good life. But then again, just working and never consuming, and effectively what they do, the Luddites, or more so the sort of religious ascetics, is they're almost like Manichaeans. They sort of treat the physical world as evil, and only the spiritual world, which is good. I mean, that's what, say, Augustine was for a time. So I simply don't see that as a legitimate critique. Just to run through the other sort of conservative or religious critiques of consumerism and to respond to them. Inequality as a cause of consumerism, I think that's highly dubious, which we'll get to shortly. The market overall, I don't see how buying things necessarily means that people will buy everything they possibly can. I mean, we simply don't observe that. I mean, we don't see buying of selling of marriages as such, although there is money aspect in marriage, etc. And I suppose the only ones who especially don't engage, well, do engage in kind of like money sort of bought marriages are those who engage in arranged marriages, and they don't tend to be accused of being hugely consumeristic. So I simply don't see why a consumer society as such would lead to the market overall by any stretch. By the market, I mean everything is up for sale. I simply don't see that as following at all. I mean that's a function of social values, etc. So, for example, the fungibility of sort of male and female work, I mean that's an outgrowth of feminism, which you could argue comes with Christianity to some extent, and also technology of various forms. But it's an ideological change, which is distinct from, well, we can buy and sell stuff. Self-worth, do people really value themselves on what they can buy? Maybe, but then previously they could have valued themselves on how much wheat they could have produced. I mean, is that any better? Well, not necessarily. So I don't really see that as a huge issue on the buying. When it comes to self-worth as such, though, I think that's more of a problem when it comes to the kind of thing that people would critique the people for consuming vulgar pleasures. So particularly in stories and sort of like soaps and stuff. Is that which is good portrayed as good there? Well, no, probably not, because most of the time it's focuses on, new romantic liaisons, because the other one is a little bit not as fun as it used to be. So go and have affairs, etc. And be good to yourself, which is probably not the best life advice. So I think in that respect, that could be a problem. But again, when it's consuming trash, you mentioned with Brian Kaplan, if you want to go to McDonald's, go to McDonald's. It's a question of diet. I mean, going to McDonald's or to like Wendy's, like, is that a problem? No. If you go there every meal for every day, is that a problem? Yeah, maybe. But you've got to look at the overall diet as opposed to just the particulars that they're consuming. So yeah, that was a lot. I just thought I'd respond to it because I brought those 5 points up.
Yes, I agree. And I want to further your point about everyone reading your Plato. This is probably only true recently. My guess, contra most paleocons who romanticize the past. I was looking at coal miners. I was recently visiting a coal mine a few months ago in my area, and I was looking at what percentage of the kids who were literate and to what level. It was not as high as people like to intend. It was probably something like a third or fourth grade reading level. Now you'll say public schools are bad. This is one area in which it's somewhat tricky. I would say that to a certain extent, if you want to be better educated, you can be better educated, and the jobs aren't as hard. Some jobs are harder, but if you look at farming or you look at most industrial jobs, working in a factory, they're very labor intensive. They're very tiring. And as Brian Kaplan points out, working hours, not Brian Kaplan, Tyler Cowen points out, working hours has declined. We do work more. Maybe they've gone up since the 70s a little bit, but on average, working hours as a population have declined since the 1900s by definition. And if you factor in the fact that many people consume at work, they watch their phone and they have breaks and all this other stuff, it's probably even less than it already is. So, but now I'm going to move into the part 3 here. What caused it? What caused it? Well, I guess you could say that scarcity caused it, which is the point you made to me privately as a joke once, and actually Ayn Rand agrees with it regarding Christmas. Is the trouble? Ayn Rand was famously said, the trouble with Christmas is it's not commercial enough. So what do you make of the causes of consumerism? Swethan, what do you factor as the causes?
Okay, so modern consumerism, as it is generally come to us, which is primarily a critique of the sort of post Second World War period. Although to be fair, there were critiques of it earlier. So I think Forster Veblen was in the 19th century. But it would seem to me that the major cause of consumerism is a debt-based society. And that has been accelerated, and that has taken place because of the banking system. And why do we have the banking system as the way we do? Well, we have the ideological foundations in Keynesian economics, in which the Keynesians are very clear. We must keep consumption high, otherwise there'll be massive unemployment. Because the Keynesians are all about keeping aggregate demand high. And how do we keep aggregate demand high? Well, we have a currency which is pure paper, or these days just digits on a screen, which you can increase ad infinitum. So you have a permanently inflationary economy. So savings, in the literal sense of saving, putting them under your bed, that reduces in value. So what do? You consume now and you don't consume in the future because it's not worth doing so. Related to that, you have the welfare state, which is generally penalizes those people who save. For example, my grandparents, my grandfather was a bin man, and my grandmother was a cleaner, I think, at a school. And they saved and didn't spend much on holidays, etc. But when they got old and they needed home helps and people to come around and help them and different things like that, the local council looked at them and said, "Oh, you've got lots of savings. Oh, well, you can pay for that." But all the people who had, 20, 30 years earlier, drunk all their money away and spent it all, those people were like, "Oh, no, you're poor. Look, here's lots of government money." So you have a situation where the welfare state and the financial system has just encouraged people to spend now and not in the future because your money will be worth less in the future. And so this, more than anything, I think, has changed people's valuations to focus on the here and now rather than anything in the future. I would also say a decline in Christianity or general religious values would make an impact here, in that we're not looking to sort of, there's no sort of eternal values that you're trying to achieve. It's just, well, whatever your subjective preference is, and so, it feels good, do it. So you have that aspect. But even if you just had, it feels good, do it, I mean, people would be generally have a lower time preference if the financial system and the welfare system was not the way that it is.
This issue is where I think the real heart of the issue lies here, because oftentimes we capitalists here we're some of the best critics of Keynesianism. Now, it is true Milton Friedman and Hayek, in some technical sense, are mild Keynesianists. True, that is to a certain extent true. But if you look at what most economists are popular in the mainstream, it's not Hayek, it's not Milton Friedman. These people are considered lunatics, fringe lunatics, let alone a person like Mises or these sort of obscure ones that, like Lionel Robbins or anybody from these obscure thinkers from the past. These are just lunatics. So this is where I think it's really frustrating, because on the one hand, we critique capitalists as saying, "Oh, you're the cause of consumers." But on the other hand, if you look at what they're right, they're saying, "Well, you're free to save." But the problem is we don't have there's a monopoly on money, and there's these huge monstrosities known as centralized banks, and we criticize them all the time. And then many people will read the New York Times and read Paul Krugman, and even mainstream Marxists like Wolfers, I think is his last name. He'll defend Keynesian more so than the libertarian Austrian version, let alone the sort of light version with Milton Friedman. So this is why I think conservatives should be all libertarians, because if you want people to act more conservative, you should make an actually fiscally conservative society in that regard. But this is where we get into the deep, to a certain extent, somewhat off topic here. But nonetheless, that's one of my ultimate frustrations regarding the Keynesian thing. And we just saw this with the stimulus bill. We just printed a bunch of checks. Now, we printed more checks for big corporations, corporate welfare. But nonetheless, you just spent everyone out $1,200. Some married couples got a little more with children. But nonetheless, you got a bunch of money spent out. This cuts down on the ability. This just deflates. The money's worth less with a space in between in the future. This is not a. This is just a logical thing. You have 10 of these. Now you're going to add 11. The people who have 10, they're not worth as much. So Swithin, do you largely agree with this characterization and frustration I have with the mainstream here? And why do the Marxists always end up siding with the Keynesianists? What's your take on that?
Oh, why do the Marxists side with the Keynesians? That's interesting. I don't know. I think it's possibly the labor theory of value, in which there's sort of some objective value and that you need to spend enough to get everybody to be employed according to their sort of so everyone gets paid what their sort of labor value is. I'm not sure on that. I'd have to think more about that. That is interesting that the Marxists well, I suppose it's because the Marxist economics is just bad, and I think it's we need to keep demand up because their critique of capitalism is basically that you get greater levels of income inequality, and the rich class basically run out of things to spend money on, so they save instead, and so there's simply not enough money going around to keep everybody employed because wages can't go down because you've got the iron law of wages, which is determined by sort of labor value. And so eventually the amount of consumption is too low to keep everyone employed and you have mass unemployment. So I think that's probably the reason. I'd have to double check my Marxist economics, but that's pretty much it. And interestingly, on a related note with the financial system, is that the inequality critique of consumerism, it seems pretty clear that the financial system with central banks and fiat money are the major cause of widespread income inequality. If you look at the income inequality in the USA, it goes down until 1971. And guess what happened in 1971? Nixon closes the gold window, and any vestige of a link to gold is got rid of. Why? Because Nixon defaulted because the government spent too much money fighting the Vietnamese and the war on poverty. So, yeah, I think that's one of the major issues. And one other, which is slightly less important, but you could argue the lack of enforcement of property rights is one reason why it may get consumerism. In that, you could argue in some cases, not all, but lots of factories simply do not bear the full costs of their actions because there's no real way of taking them to court with respect to air pollution, which according to Rothbard happened in the 19th century, but because the government wanted to encourage industrialization, they got the courts basically not to enforce them anymore. So you would take a factory to court and you said, oh no, this smog is here, is destroying my clothes and stuff, and the judges didn't hear of it. So actually on the environmental aspect, if you want to be an environmentalist, you should be a private property libertarian, at least in that respect, because you would actually bear the full cost of your actions.
Okay, Swithin. So we'll move on to the final part of this episode here, which is the can consumerism be good question. I guess ultimately, to circle back to your very first one, consumer is what we say. What anyone says that I dislike, it's sort of like it's a swear word. You filthy consumerists. One of the points I think Mises brought up maybe 100 years ago was, I think from my understanding, Mises liked opera, but he thought that no one else would like it. So now, since it was state subsidized, this means that This means that if it was democratized, it would fall apart. It wouldn't have enough money to do, and that actually might be the case. Now, but then again, I, as a libertarian anarchist, I'm somewhat agnostic on culture. You might be somewhat more conservative on culture here than me, but I would say, like Brian Kaplan, if you want to eat McDonald's every day, go ahead. But you don't have a right to force others to extract taxes and build an opera house and employ a whole thing. I think actually Mises admitted to this as well. So can there be such a thing as good consumers? I think there is such thing as a good thing, consumerism. But then again, on culture, I'm somewhat agnostic. What's your views with it?
Consumerism of a sort is good. With culture, I mean, does consumer culture, as it were, cause like a declining culture? I think it gives outlets, as it were, to more vulgar kind of artworks, as it were. But I would say really the cultural change primarily began in the high arts, and they're the ones who kind of started the degradation in that respect. So, for example, with the influence of postmodern thought, the lack of sort of meta-narratives being genuinely true, this begets sort of high art in the form of Samuel Beckett to some extent, James Joyce, and the importance of sort of like narrative story as such is kind of got rid of in high arts. It's almost considered kind of narrative story itself is considered vulgar. This is where you get sort of the art house films in which basically nothing happens. I mean, I'm quite favourably disposed towards art house films, but some of them are just incredibly dull and nothing actually happens. And I think the changing, actually, interestingly, at the top of the arts in culture is probably the biggest problem. And if you had a more healthy, sophisticated art scene, I think the rest of lower culture would follow. Is low culture sophisticated? No, by definition it's not. But is there good versions of low culture? Yes, of course there is. I mean, you can see like in pop music or in because really pop music is really a form of folk music in a sense. It's not sophisticated in the same way that, say, classical music is. But I mean, there's obviously crossovers. I mean, you could argue like progressive rock is somewhere in between. It's an attempt to do sort of the sophistication of sort of what you would get in sort of classical works with sort of in a more popular genre, although progressive rock isn't particularly popular anymore. But there are good versions of kind of folk culture, it's a pop track. You've got good tunes and you can recognize that they are. And to be fair to Roger Scruton would recognize this. And I think he would agree, I think, largely with what I've said, although I think he would have more of a place for gatekeepers to sort of make sure that the hoi polloi tastes are sort of directed into a better direction, which, to be fair, I have no intrinsic objection to. But the idea that consumerism as such creates bad culture, I think, is untrue.
Yes, I would agree, and I would agree that most of what conservatives would argue the decline of culture occurred at the top, where they were not affected by market forces, and this occurred right before the rise of mass consumer society, as anthropologists or sociologists would argue. So I would argue it's an intellectual change that happened beforehand. And secondly, as far as Roger Scruton is concerned, I think another problem that people generally have, your sort of cultural declinists on the street would have, is that first, you only remember the greats of the past. So, I mean, there are some people who could probably quote more people, that English authors in a certain period, in 1500 or 1600s, but then everyone will just remember Shakespeare. There is great authors that are alive. We might not know them until 100 years from now. Many now great authors in the past that even conservatives like died penniless or not in the best of straits. So it took them a while to get popular. And secondly, I think it's Mozart only listened to his sympathy maybe 3 times in his life, even if that. I mean, this is where I'm going to circle back to my first points about superabundance of TVs and computers and headphones. You can listen to this on YouTube for free anytime you want. Maybe there's a short ad. You can listen, great quality. This was something only the elites could do. Only the elites. And this was an aristocratic elite. This is not the sort of capitalistic elite. This elite was very small. So more people can consume classical culture if they want to. And thanks to recording, we have that all available. Now, why don't people watch it? Again, I don't think it's consumerism as such. I'd say it's just people don't believe in anything with a capital B, or at least most people don't. And funnily enough, I would say the lower class, and this is we're going to start wrapping it up here, but the lower class might have better taste than the higher class today. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I view the elites, especially the non-Christian elites, which is by definition, as having terrible tastes. What do you think?
Oh, I think that's generally true in certain respects. I would say maybe not with music, but with narrative. There's a lot more to be said about the more pulpy sort of storytellers. They're not producing high art, and I wouldn't particularly enjoy them a huge amount, but they recognize the craft of writing. They seem to be more attentive to different cultural artifacts and take a non sort of ideological approach to it, whereas some of the elites would treat things purely through an ideological lens and therefore produce terrible art. And for example, the social justice sort of infiltration of like the comic book scene is a good example of this. They do not understand comics. They don't like them particularly. You don't have any invested in, say, like the Batman franchise or the Spider-Man. And so they just turn it into the same old SJW narrative every time, which is just bad art. And these are people who are, well, they're at least upper middle class in most cases. So yes, I think in certain respects, yes, I think you're generally correct. So I suppose we're saying that consumerism is good. I suppose you could say the abundance of artworks and things mean people don't have the right attitude towards the artworks as they did. So, for example, if you could only ever listen to Mozart once, when you did, you would take more care in listening to it, and you wouldn't just have it on as background music as such. So there is a question of how you would orientate yourself towards it, which I think is a fair critique. And one thing I was going to say on a critique of consumerism, just so I know, circling back a bit, but one of the arguments against it is it kind of says, oh, the only way you get value is by consuming things, and orientates people away from sort of engaging in work to attempt to help others, etc. Which I suppose is possible, but if you treat helping people as, in a sense, an end in itself, you could say that you are, as it were, I mean, Rothbard would treat that as a form of consumption. So there's bad and good consumption. I think the bottom line is that we are embodied people living in a scarce world with limited time horizons, and a necessary part of the good life is having a lot of material resources, because it gives you time to engage in prayer, speculation, and using man's distinctive faculty of reason. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone would do it. If they had it, they would do other things, but so the classical sort of virtues and sort of the good life as proposed by sort of like the Roman society or the Greeks is only possible on a large scale by having large level of technology and material wealth, and that requires, at least in large part, that people buy stuff from other people.
Yes, and one of the points that you have to bring up is when we read about the Greeks, people like Cato the Elder, he owned fields of captured slaves. And the Greeks, they disdained to work, but the Greeks again were somewhat slave owners, and so forth. And as people like Tom Holland would point out, this is not a progressive society. This is a very harsh society that treated the outsiders very poorly. Maybe not their immediate outsiders. They had no trouble having slaves. So if you want to have the life of leisure, you need to a certain extent have superabundance. And based on empirical understanding, we work less than we used to, and which gives us more time to do free time. Now, you can do whatever you want to do with your free time, and you can also have the freedom not to work as much and just live in a small apartment and take nice vacations, or join a Jesuit monastery. Now, as a libertarian, I want to even have more freedom by getting away the state and the central banks. So with that, I don't know if you have any further thoughts, Suthan, on that, but I think this is...
All I'd like to say is thank you everyone for listening, and if you've enjoyed this, please like and share and subscribe to us on YouTube or on Spotify. And if you'd like to get into contact with us for ideas about the show or any topics you think we should cover, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That is mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.